I've always been the curious type, especially when it comes to exploring new places. So when my friend Julia invited me to spend the weekend at her family's cabin deep in the woods, I couldn't resist. She'd told me stories about the cabin, how it had been in her family for generations, and how no one had ever stayed there alone after dark. She said it had a strange, unsettling energy, but I just thought she was exaggerating. The drive was long, 3 hours through winding roads and thick forests, but once we arrived, I was eager to see the cabin for myself. It looked like something out of an old fairy tale, surrounded by towering trees and nestled in a quiet valley. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine. The cabin itself was old, its wooden frame weathered by time, but sturdy and well kept. Julia greeted me with a smile, her family already inside, preparing for a cozy weekend. That night, as we sat around the fireplace, Julia's uncle, who'd lived in the cabin for years, shared strange stories. He spoke of things he'd seen in the woods, shadowy figures moving between the trees, strange noises at night, and of course the room. "There's a room in the cabin," he said, his voice low and serious, "that doesn't exist." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but he didn't smile. He seemed completely serious. "What do you mean, doesn't exist?" I asked. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "No one really talks about it. It's been there for as long as I can remember, but no one's ever been able to find it during the day. But at night, when the house is quiet, it appears." I stared at him, not sure if he was just trying to scare us. "What happens if you find it?" I asked, my voice tinged with skepticism. "That's the thing," Julia's uncle said. "No one who's found it has ever been the same again. Some say it shows you things you're not supposed to see. Others claim it drives you mad. But everyone agrees on one thing: the room is not something you should ever enter." The room seemed to hang in the air after that, the unspoken warning lingering in the firelight. But despite the chilling story, I didn't believe him. It was just a tale to entertain the family, nothing more. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I lay in my room staring at the ceiling, trying to fall asleep. The cabin creaked as if it were alive, settling into the night. It was cold, the air thick with the scent of wood and damp earth. I tossed and turned, but sleep wouldn't come. At some point, I got up to use the bathroom. As I stepped into the hall, I noticed something strange. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly ajar. It wasn't there earlier, I was sure of it. I walked toward it, drawn by an inexplicable urge. As I reached for the handle, I hesitated. The door was old, with brass hinges that creaked as I opened it just a crack. My breath caught in my throat. There, on the other side, was a small room. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust. The air was thick, and the light from the hallway barely reached inside. I could see a small wooden chair in the center, facing the wall. The room felt wrong. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stepped inside, despite every instinct telling me to turn around. The door clicked shut behind me. I couldn't explain it, but something in the air seemed to shift. The room was colder now, and the shadows seemed to press in closer. I turned toward the chair, feeling a sudden compulsion to sit. As I moved closer, the silence seemed to deepen, almost as if the room was absorbing every sound around me. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I sat down in the chair, almost as if I had no choice. Time seemed to slow. Then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, just a murmur in the distance. But as I sat there, the whispers grew louder until they surrounded me, pressing in on all sides. They were voices, strange, distorted voices, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I felt a pressure in my chest, as if the room were suffocating me. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The room was silent once again, and I felt something watching me. I turned toward the corner where the shadows were thickest, and saw a figure, just a shadow, but unmistakable. It was standing still, watching me. I jumped up from the chair, my heart racing. The door was locked. I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. I turned back to the room, and the shadow was gone, replaced by a feeling of overwhelming dread. With a final desperate push, I managed to force the door open. I rushed out, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't stop running until I was back in my room, where I slammed the door and locked it behind me. The next morning, Julia and her family seemed unfazed. They spoke as if nothing unusual had happened. but I knew what I had experienced. I knew what I had seen. The room was real, and whatever it held, it wasn't something meant to be found. It wasn't just a story. I left the cabin early that morning, and though Julia begged me to stay, I couldn't. I don't know what's in that room, but I never want to find out. The darkness it holds is something no one should see, and now I carry the memory of it with me, a reminder that some doors should never be opened. I had always loved staying in old hotels. There's something about their eerie charm, the worn carpets, the creaky stairs, the faint smell of history, that made every stay feel like an adventure. So when I booked a room at a hotel on the outskirts of town, I didn't think much of it. I thought it would be just another quiet weekend getaway, but it turned into something much darker. I arrived at the hotel late in the evening. It was a tall, narrow building, wedged between two older structures, with a faded neon sign that flickered on and off. The exterior looked run down, like it hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint in decades. I should have paid attention to my gut, but I didn't. I just wanted a place to crash for the night. The lobby was dark, the only light coming from a dim lamp behind the check-in counter. The air felt damp and stale, like it had been sealed off from the outside world. I approached the desk and rang the bell. A few moments later, a man appeared from the shadows, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken. "Checking in?" he asked in a voice so low I had to strain to hear it. I nodded, handing him my reservation details. He didn't say anything else, just handed me a rusty key with a tag that had the number 203 written on it. I thanked him and took the elevator to the second floor. The old lift groaned as it moved, its steel walls rattling with each floor it passed. When I arrived at my room, the door creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The room was small, with a single bed in the center, a faded rug on the floor, and a window that looked out onto the street. The walls were thin, and I could hear the sound of someone moving in the room next door. I shrugged it off, unpacking my bag and tossing my clothes onto the bed. I went to the bathroom to freshen up, but when I looked into the mirror, I noticed something strange. There was a shadow behind me, standing just outside the bathroom door. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart started to race. The shadow had been so distinct, like a person standing there, watching me. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just the dim lighting playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I tried to ignore it, but when I crawled into bed that night, I couldn't stop looking at the window. The curtains were drawn, but the streetlights outside cast a faint glow into the room. That's when I saw it, movement, just beyond the edge of the curtain. I froze, staring at the shadow moving slowly across the window. I sat up in bed, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Was someone outside? I grabbed my phone, thinking of calling the front desk, but the screen flickered, then went black. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I got up and moved toward the window, trying to peer through the small gap between the curtains. There was nothing. The street was empty, the sidewalk barren. I breathed a sigh of relief, chalking it up to my imagination. But as I turned to walk back to the bed, I heard a soft tap on the window behind me. I spun around, my heart thudding against my chest. There, pressed against the glass, was the faint outline of a face. I screamed, stumbling backward. The face was blurred, like someone had smeared the glass from the outside. I ran to the door, pulling it open and rushing into the hallway. The hotel was silent, eerily quiet, and when I reached the stairs, I looked back. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. I ran down the stairs and rushed to the front desk, but when I reached it, the lobby was completely dark. The man who had checked me in was nowhere to be found. The bell on the counter was the only sound in the room, ringing softly in the silence. I stood there, trembling, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Panic surged through me, and I bolted toward the exit, yanking open the door and stumbling out into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys to unlock it. I slammed the door shut behind me and drove off, my heart still racing. It wasn't until I got home that I realized something was wrong. My phone had started working again, and when I checked the photos I had taken earlier, I found something chilling. There, in the reflection of the hotel room window, was a figure standing just behind me. I hadn't seen anyone when I looked back, but the photo showed a shadowy figure with hollow eyes, its face contorted into a twisted grin. I don't know who or what was watching me that night. I don't know if it was a ghost or if the hotel itself was somehow alive, but I know one thing for sure: I will never go back there. The silent watcher still haunts me, lurking in the corners of my mind, waiting for me to return. I've never been a fan of maps, mostly because they always seem to lead me off track. But one afternoon I found myself following a route that wasn't on any of my GPS apps. I didn't mean to get lost, but it happened, and I ended up in the strangest place, a village that wasn't supposed to exist. It all started when I took a back road, looking for a shortcut. I was trying to avoid the busy highway, the same one I drove every day, and I figured the backcountry roads would be quieter. The sun was setting and I just wanted to get to my destination, but the road seemed to stretch on endlessly. I wasn't paying too much attention to the time, and the further I drove, the more I realized the landscape around me was changing. The trees grew thicker, the air heavier. That's when I saw the sign, "Welcome to 𝐿𝐴𝐺𝐺." It looked old, weathered, like it had been there for centuries. I didn't know of any village by that name, and when I tried to search it on my phone, it came up with nothing. The signal was weak in the area, but I could still make out a few maps that seemed to suggest the village was off the grid. I thought it was odd, but curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to drive through. The village was like something out of an old storybook: cobblestone streets, ivy-covered cottages, and a stillness in the air that felt too perfect, too serene. The houses were quaint, almost frozen in time. It was a scene so picturesque it could have been an old painting, except it was too quiet, too still. There was no traffic, no cars, not even a sound from the wildlife. It was like the village was stuck in some forgotten era. I passed a few people on the street. They smiled at me, nodding as if they had known I'd be coming. Their faces were pale, their smiles too wide, and their eyes too intense. Something in their expressions made my skin crawl, like they were seeing through me, not just to me. I drove through the village slowly, taking in the strange atmosphere. It wasn't exactly unfriendly, but there was an air of discomfort that I couldn't shake off. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I was just tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I saw the inn. It stood out from the rest of the village, an old, dilapidated building with a wooden sign hanging over the door, creaking in the wind. The paint was peeling, and the window panes were cracked. I was tired, and the village seemed to stretch on endlessly. I figured it was time to stop for the night. I pulled up to the inn, and before I even got out of the car, the door opened. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his frail body framed by the dim light inside. He had a thick accent, but his voice was warm, inviting. "A room for the night, yes?" he asked. It wasn't a question, it was more like a statement. His smile seemed to reach too far across his face. I nodded, unsure why I felt a little uneasy. "Yes, please. I've been driving for hours." "Of course," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. "There are no other places around. You will stay here for the night. You're safe." The inn was dimly lit, the air musty with the scent of old wood and stale air. The man led me up a narrow staircase to a room at the end of the hall. The walls creaked underfoot, and the floorboards groaned as though the building itself was protesting my presence. The room itself wasn't much, just a bed, a small window with a view of the village square, and an antique dresser. I noticed a cracked mirror above the dresser, but there was something strange about the reflection. It seemed off. The image in the glass was blurry, like I was looking at myself through fogged-up windows. But I shrugged it off. It had been a long day. I just wanted to sleep. I locked the door and lay down, hoping to get some rest. But just as I closed my eyes, I heard a sound, a faint creaking like footsteps down the hallway. I froze, my heart pounding. The house was old, so maybe it was just the building settling. But then I heard it again, louder this time. Someone walking, slow, deliberate steps that were coming closer. I jumped out of bed, heart racing. I opened the door, expecting to find the old man, but there was no one in the hallway. It was silent, empty. Confused, I returned to my room, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to take over, but it didn't come. The clock ticked slowly, each second like an eternity. That's when I heard it again, whispers, barely audible, like voices coming from the walls. I sprang up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, but my voice sounded muffled, distant. No one answered. The whispers continued, growing louder. It was like they were calling my name, soft, urgent, pleading. I tried to ignore it, but the sound seemed to grow stronger, more insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed out of the room, but the hallway was even more suffocating now. The air was thick, like I was walking through a fog. I reached the staircase and ran down to the front door, but when I tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. It was locked. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. That's when I noticed something even stranger. The village outside was gone. The windows were black, and no matter how much I pressed my face against the glass, I couldn't see anything. The streets were empty, the air still. I turned back to the innkeeper, but when I called out, there was no reply. He had disappeared. The whole village had vanished, leaving me alone in that suffocating darkness. I don't know how long I've been here. Time feels twisted, like it's been stretched out. Every time I try to leave, I end up back at the inn, as if the village itself won't let me go. I've asked the people, but they don't speak, they just stare with those hollow eyes. I don't think I'll ever escape Elder Grove.